Hey sis! From coast to coast, we're bridging the gap between the cisgender and transgender community, creating meaningful dialogue and space to learn and grow.
Join us as we connect with our community, break down tough conversations, and get comfortable being better humans. Welcome back to Hey Sis. We are your hosts, Sin Sweeney.
And I'm Isaac Cook. We hope you all enjoyed a fantastic summer wherever you're joining us from. As we dive into season 3, we also want to extend a huge thank you to all of you who have tuned in and subscribed since fall of 2020. Thanks to you, the Hey Sis podcast is ranked number 2 on FeedSpot's top number 20 best Canadian talk shows. This is huge because it lets us know we're connecting with you and hopefully sharing engaging stories celebrating trans and queer people from coast to coast and beyond, and breaking down stigma along the way.
And guess what? Season 3 is proudly sponsored by TD Bank Group, making community connections even more accessible. More episodes, guests, and amazing stories. And speaking of accessibility, in today's episode, we are joined by guest Rachele Manett. Rachele is a queer, Jewish, disabled sexuality educator, currently the education coordinator for Venus Envy Halifax, an education-based sex shop and bookstore located in Kjipuktuk, Halifax. They organize and deliver workshops on all sorts of sexy topics. Rachele uses she, they pronouns and presents at universities across the province of Nova Scotia. And if you're a parent, caregiver of a transgender, gender expansive, or non-binary youth, teen, or young adult, or you're an educator, this episode is all about inclusion, pleasure, accessibility, and breaking down stigma linked to cisnormative bias. Please join us in welcoming Rachele to the show.
Hello.
Welcome back.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. We're really excited to have you here in September, right after the summer, as we're launching season 3.
Yeah, great to be back. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Awesome. So, Rachele, maybe you could help us first and foremost kind of break down and define what does cisnormativity mean in pleasure?
Mm-hmm. So the way that I've always looked at it, the idea of cisnormativity being and I'll often sort of couple it with like cis heteronormativity, this idea that everyone is cis or straight, and that we're all like born cis and straight, and it's like going away from that sort of deviates from the norm, versus everyone just sort of being who they are and having lots of different ways that they can interact with the world. But yeah, the idea that being cisgender and being straight or heterosexual is the norm, and that anything outside of that is odd or strange or different or like deviates from, what we're supposed to be doing. And so when it comes to pleasure, I think that there's a lot of, other layers to it. So this idea that, being cisgender, being straight is what's attractive, is what's sexy, is who deserves pleasure. And that there's specific ways that we're supposed to have sex, that we're supposed to experience pleasure. Often these are linked to penetrative sex, and that everything outside of that is odd or not like real sex. And I'm putting like quotation marks around that, real sex. And so I think that's a lot of the time where it comes up. But what makes things more complicated is that tons of people experience pleasure in a multitude of ways, and quite often not from solely penetrative pleasure, but for penetrative sex. And so, where these ideas of what's normal and what's natural and what is, supposed to happen, they stop us from feeling the pleasure that we could be feeling, because we think we're supposed to feel it one way, even though most of us have a hard time with that. With all sorts of different kinds of bodies, it's hard to, feel pleasure from just solely penetration alone.
So why don't we dive a little bit into that a little bit more? And I'd love for you to be able to share, as I said in the introduction, that you have a particular interest in accessible sex practices and pleasure experiences. What would be, some of the challenges that you've heard about or experienced, challenges that queer people face when accessing pleasure?
Yeah, I think the main one is that we're not given a lot of like good examples. In like all of the media I grew up watching, there was always straight people doing one very specific looking kind of sex or pleasure. And when someone doesn't quite fall into that or has tried something that looks like that and it doesn't quite work, there's a lot of like, oh, maybe I'll never get to feel this way. And like, I didn't come out until I was in my early 20s. I didn't even know that that was an option for me, just because I hadn't had any role models around that. And so I get very excited to be a queer adult role model in queer youth's lives. One of my favorite things to do and be involved with. But yeah, there is this idea of like what pleasure is supposed to look like, and we're fed that pretty regularly through media and also through education. I was just recently working on a project with a group of queer youth who were putting together essentially a response to the sex ed book that goes out to like all Nova Scotians every year. You're like nodding, you know what I'm talking
The classic,
about.
the classic,
exactly. Yeah. And there has been some like minuscule updates to that book to sort of be like, yes, queer people exist and like gender non-conforming people exist and trans people exist. But, it still very much feels like an afterthought. And so this group of youth was like, we don't really like this. Can we do something better? And which was really exciting. And so I got brought into this project to work with them. And so they put together kind of like a response book or like zine to just be like, this is coming from like a queer youth perspective. And yeah, we're hoping to distribute that amongst, different schools and things like that. So for everyone listening who are educators or parents and grandparents and stuff, look out for that. It'll be available.
I love that. And when it comes out, we can put a link in the show notes. But I think that's especially resonates for me because as a parent of a trans child, and then I would be, let's say, bordering 50, perhaps in the early parts of 50. I'm being raised in a small town in Ontario, Brampton. I had a very sort of also traditional family upbringing. So you talk about visibility on television and then the influence of like what's talked about or not talked about in school, but also the home plays such a huge piece. And so for, say, some parents and caregivers out there of trans youth who maybe have been raised in that very, like, I remember there was a lot of kind of shame put on anything that was outside of the traditional model of what pleasure was supposed to look like. And I would beg to argue that I'm probably not alone in that with my generation, having kind of grown up that way with limited information and knowledge that, when it comes to trying to support queer youth and teens, we could use a little bit of help.
Yeah. Well, and I just want to take that and like almost do one step backwards to the idea that I don't even think we're straight up not acknowledging queer people, period. But we're not even acknowledging the fact that sex isn't just purely for reproduction. I remember like all of those books, it was just about this is how you make a baby. And I'm like, cool. But like, we're not discussing how to have pleasure out of it or what sex looks like in other ways. For instance, for like asexual people or aromantic people who might not, feel the same way that other people do in those terms of things. And we're not acknowledging that sex isn't purely reproductive. Like, and I think that's kind of like the root of the problem.
Yeah, a lot of conversations that I have to, or that I sort of choose to avoid, like I am not a reproduction expert. That is not where my expertise lies. I am very much rooted in pleasure. I'm like, let's talk about like the parts of our bodies that feel good to touch and that like, anyone can touch for themselves. A lot of the education I do, especially with youth, I find that they're getting a lot of information on how to have a baby, how to avoid having a baby, and then how to avoid like STIs. But no one's really talking about like self-pleasure. And that is one of the safest ways to like explore the body and to get a sense of what feels good and what's exciting. And, when people are very young and, and consent is more complicated and, rules around that and what have you, like self-exploration is such an important option for people. And I think like growing up, I didn't know that I could explore myself in that way. I sort of felt like I was trying to hide it. And with that comes this expectation of, well, like sex has to happen with another person or pleasure has to happen with another person. And so, we as youth go out exploring outside of ourselves and maybe without a lot of information, we start, doing more risky behaviors. And I'm also like all for like a little risk is good. It helps us learn and helps us grow, but when it's the only option to engage in what could be considered like very risky, it's not, having that as the only option is not necessarily a good option. So yeah, like self-pleasure and self-exploration, so important for us to get to know our bodies and figure out what we like. But also there's this empowerment, for me at least, of like, I own my own pleasure. Like my body is mine and I get to control who has access to it. And it's so much easier to do that when I've taken the time to actually explore it on my own and know that I can give myself pleasure and that I'm able to. And so that's always been like a huge reason for self-pleasure for me, at least, and something that I try to sort of impart to other people that I'm speaking with.
Yeah, and it's tricky too because so many folks, especially queer people, I will say with emphasis, only kind of get to that point when they're in their 20s or 30s or even older. So during those prime puberty stages where you're feeling a lot of different things, you're not able
Yes.
to properly find appropriate, safe outlets to find self-pleasure. And that can like fall into those categories, as you were mentioning, of like risky behavior because you don't know how to release that.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to kind of jump on, you mentioned briefly kind of about your own experiences. And back when we first spoke in May of 2022, you talked about how being a part of a marginalized community often intersects with being disabled. And we were just curious if you could share maybe a bit of your own personal perspective on how this relates to you.
Yeah. So, going from sort of like a self-pleasure standpoint and a pleasure standpoint in general, I guess, in the same way that, sex ed and media and things don't really include queer and trans and non-binary people, we're also missing a lot of representation from like disabled people and bodies that, don't look a certain way. I think that this extends to things like race and, body shapes and body types and things like that. But, speaking from my own personal experience as someone who is disabled, like that's what I was missing. I was missing seeing people with mobility aids and how they like interacted with the world around them, or seeing people whose bodies looked like a little, and I say this as someone whose body looks a little like curved in some weird places because of my spine. Like, I didn't see a lot of that on TV growing up, unless it was like the storyline. Like things like the Elephant Man and stuff like that. And, that wasn't exactly like a heartfelt story. It was pretty sad. They weren't talking about the Elephant Man, like masturbating and stuff like that. It was all like how he was treated very poorly. And so, growing up with that in my mind, I was like, do disabled people get to have pleasure? There's also all these other rules that go along with how people get it on, how people have sex and feel pleasure together. And, one of the biggest myths that come up is around this idea of like spontaneity. Where like every time we have sex, there should be no conversation that happens. I'm saying all of this with big sarcastic tones. There should be no conversation. We just like meet eyes from across the room in some crowded place, and then like it skips to a scene where we're like already touching each other and like making out, and then it skips to another scene where we are like half clothed but under the covers in bed. We've already had sex, kind of thing. So seeing that leaves a lot to be desired, and also it leaves a lot of information like what happens in between all those moments. And so and I think it sort of is similar when it comes to queer sex and queer pleasure, where, if we're experiencing bodies in different ways than we've sort of been told is like the norm, there's no instruction manual. There's nothing that's telling us this is how you do it. This is how you can start, how to explore. There's a lot of exploration that kind of happens on the fly, but there isn't really, there's no instruction manual for that. And I kind of like that personally. I think that once sort of disability became a part of my life and my existence, I was like, oh, I can throw this entire rule book that I thought existed out the window because it's clearly not working for me anymore. Like I had to rethink a lot of stuff, but I also think that has had a big effect on how I see queer sex existing. A lot of people come into the store and ask for like position books, you know, and position books are like, I guess, a fun thing to look at, but they're not
Something
great
to put on your wall.
Exactly, right? Something to put on your wall. They're like a cool art form, I suppose, but exactly, like ripping them out and putting them up. But, you know, they're not super great for like most bodies to try something. I would say that in any given position book, like 20% of the positions are actually usable for like most people. But definitely there's always a lack of like queer representation. There's always a lack of disabled representation. And usually there's a lack of, you know, like race representation as well, and like just different body types and that kind of representation. So, you know, position books are like not all they're supposed to be. But you know, when I'm doing workshops specifically about disabled sexuality and you know, sort of moving beyond our expectations of what sex is supposed to look like, a lot of what I talk about is, or a lot of what I'm asked actually is, well, how can I like rethink positioning? What kind of positions can I do for my body? And I was like, well, my way of thinking of positions is just like, okay, I want this body part to touch this body part. What is a comfortable way of doing that? What is a sexy way of doing that? And by sexy, I'm like, how can I look at this body part while I'm touching this body part? Like, it's just, in my mind, it's so much more abstract than like looking at it in a book and being like, this is the sex position. And when people ask for names of sex positions, I'm like, I don't know. That's not, they're all made up anyways. Let's just make them up more. So yeah, I tend to have to do a lot of like unlearning of what we're supposed to look like when we're having sex, and instead just think about how it feels and what's exciting about it, you know?
Yeah, I really like that like mapping like
Yeah.
idea, because it's so true though, because you're like, I want this, but like I need this, and then you actually try it and you're like, okay, no, there's no way in like heck that's gonna happen unless we like dislocate a leg or something. But I find too, especially as like a trans person myself, in a relationship with another trans person, being in a like, I think they call it like T for T
Yeah.
relationship, is so liberating, because you understand each other's bodies, and at least you understand, I find for me it's almost like you understand boundaries.
Can I ask a question then, as sort of coming from a parent point of view, and maybe you could provide some advice then for parents and caregivers and even educators around how they can create more meaningful conversations around bodily autonomy and reducing isolation around pleasure? Because I think, you know, say for younger children who transition and maybe they're in that tween age, early teens, you know, often there's no visibility in the sexual health component in schools. And I've even heard some kids being told, oh, well, you're never going to be able to experience pleasure the way I will be able to. You know, you're never going to feel like this because you're not a real insert boy, girl. And so how, as, you know, being a supportive piece in that, how can we, you know, break that down and start having, you know, give more, I guess, meaningful visibility and some options, you know, letting people know like, no, this is not what it's all about.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's sort of like a two-pronged approach, and one has to do with like consent practices. Because this idea of bodily autonomy, while it's a human right, it also is kind of a skill, and like it involves a lot of skill building. I think like as young people, we're often not given a lot of opportunities for our own bodily autonomy, for our own consent practices. I've been really excited to see my own nephews growing up with like, do you want to hug this person, as like an option? Just little things like that, of being like, your body is your own and you get to choose what to do with it. There's no expectations, regardless of family members, of caregivers, of like teachers and whoever in that person's life. It's still that person's choice what they do with their body. And so I think that's a big piece of it. Consent is a hard concept to grasp if we don't get to practice it. And, you know, like growing up where it was like, okay, like you hug your grandparents, you hug these people, you don't have to hug these people, but you have to hug these people. It's kind of like, well, even those rules confuse us. You know, like I grew up thinking that I had to hug certain people. And sometimes it was because I was like scared of them or because they were some authority figure. And just little bits like that chip away at our own bodily autonomy in such drastic ways a lot of the time, where we don't know what's right and what's wrong. And so I think that's a big part of it, is practicing those things early on. And then when it comes to sort of the other prong, if you will, offer, I think, I don't know, I am of the belief that no one is ever too young to get to know their own bodies. Using the terminology that feels good for it, but also knowing the sort of like scientific terminology can help a lot in having conversations about body parts, and knowing what to say when something goes wrong, when something's a little scary. Or a lot scarier, when something, has become harmful. As much as like using the correct or sort of, scientific terms for body parts can also elicit some like emotional responses a lot of the time, it's important to at least know what they are. But yeah, like offering space to talk about those things, I think is really important, and offering opportunities to talk about pleasure. We talk about body parts from like very young ages of like, well, this is like a no-no zone, right? I can't remember how many times. And obviously there's certain people who shouldn't be touching the no-no zone, but it shouldn't be, I feel like calling it a no-no zone is very iffy, because it means that that person will now think, well, I'm not supposed to touch that part. And that discomfort with our own bodies leads to so many issues down the road. I mean, how many of us are afraid of like our own bodily functions? I know so many people who are so afraid of pee and poo, and I'm like, we all do that. We all do that. I mean, not everyone, lots of people, for a variety of reasons, have like ostomy bags or things like that, and like catheters and stuff. But, everyone has some form of excrement that comes out of them in some way or another. Like, why are we so afraid? Or even being afraid of my own menstrual cycle. Like, it took me a long time to be like, this is just a part of my body. And, while it brings up different feelings, depending on the month, it's still like, it's not gross, it's not dirty, it's not bad. It can be complicated. There's a lot of complications around that kind of stuff for a variety of reasons. But it's not yucky, I guess, is the thing. And, that conversation around like, your body is your body, and whatever, it feels like to you is okay. That's such a huge step in giving people the go ahead to explore their body and be comfy with their body and things like that.
Yeah. And I just want to echo everything that you just said. And I think I'm going to be that person. I'll say it. But like, pleasure and sexuality has been for so long, and still is, dominated by the patriarchy and kind of male gaze on what pleasure looks like. So that's why so many people in modern day are scared of, menstruating, or scared of their own genitals, because if they don't have set genitalia, that whoever created the mentality many years ago, then you can't experience pleasure, or that sex is only good if the man comes, and that's when it's done. And there's like that ongoing joke that, women are assigned female at birth, or individuals with vaginas, they don't come, kind of thing. And it's or reach orgasm, I should say. And it's so interesting to talk about in modern day, because we're at the point where so many people are aware, but no one's really talking about it and getting into those really, really difficult conversations.
Right? Like, there's still this stigma. Can I add in? It's funny. This is an interesting story, because so I went into Venus Envy, and on where you're located there on Barrington Street. I remember going in looking, I wanted to find some resources, just like books and some stickers and that are around trans youth, and like getting an idea around like what they offer to be able to give information to other parents around STPs and Packers and all of those, which is a whole other episode altogether. I remember going in, and I remember kind of looking in the back of the room and going, oh, I haven't gone into a store like this in so long. Oh my gosh, I'm so repressed. So I kind of went to the back of the room, and I was kind of like looking around with my hand kind of over my, with my sunglasses on. Anyway, it was ridiculous. And up comes someone who works there, and they're like, hi, Cynthia. Oh yeah, our kids go to school together. I think they slept over last week. And I was like, and they're like, can I help you? And I was like, no, I'm just going to have a little look around. That's okay. And then I actually ended up finding someone else saying, hey, I'm kind of interested in this, but it was so funny, the discomfort I felt, I don't know, like that embarrassment. It comes back to where I kind of came from and my roots and all that. But anyway, now I can just march in there and walk to the back of the room, and I'm quite happy and confident to do so. But I was kind of like, what is wrong with me? 50-year-old woman, like, get in there and own it, yeah, there's just, I think as a society, we need to get comfortable talking about this, and especially, if you're supporting queer youth and that, because if they don't know what is available to them, we're generally policing their access to pleasure, right?
Absolutely. And it's so honestly kind of normal that you were uncomfortable going into a sex shop for like after like a long while of maybe not going into a sex shop. Like I would say that it's one of the most common experiences. So many people are like, they're like whispery, they don't want to like talk about things, they just want to be shown like where the toys are. A lot of people don't even know what the toys are called. Like a lot of people come in and say like, I want a dildo. And I'm like, okay, sure. Like, and I show them the dildos and they're like, but none of these vibrate. And I'm like, oh, you want a vibrator. Like there's vibrating dildos. Yes. But normally, I don't know, people just don't know even the terms for the toys that they want and things like that. And I work in a sex shop. I think sex toys are great. They're, and from kind of coming from like a accessibility perspective, like toys help us access pleasure in ways that we maybe couldn't before. They make, sensations like vibrations that our bodies don't normally make. They help us like reach areas that we maybe couldn't reach on our own. They help us access parts of our bodies that our bodies can't necessarily get to on their own. And just, it makes it easier for us to feel pleasure. And, for a lot of reasons, people have like sensory sort of like stimulation concerns, and so a toy can be that barrier between your own body part and another body part. And while we're sort of getting used to touching our own bodies and figuring out what that all feels like and means for us and what's comfy, there's something that can be that middle thing, that thing that's kind of a barrier but also a facilitator, if you will. But yeah, it's such a very common experience for people to be just like super uncomfortable with the conversation until they get to have the conversation. I think that's like my favorite part of what I do is like, when I kind of love when people are uncomfortable. I love taking people from that discomfort to that place of like more comfort or even just less discomfort. It's kind of like what gets me up in the morning. It's what makes me love the work, is to just take people from that place of like, oh, I'm not sure, like, oh, I don't know how to talk about this, to, okay, that wasn't so bad. That like sigh of relief of like, yeah, I did it. I bought my first vibrator, or like, yeah, I bought my first butt plug, or whatever. Like I could have these conversations and it's not so weird anymore.
And I think one of my favorite things, especially as when I was a little baby queer and I go into Venus Envy, is that everyone who works there is so confident and comfortable, but like very calm. Like there's no like pressure. Like it's such a safe environment that you can go in and be like, I'm looking for blah, 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 blah. And they're like, cool, we'll find it. Like there's no hesitation. And it's just very, very positive environment. So I wanted to ask, can you maybe share with us some of the best practices at Venus Envy, and what does the team do to ensure you're offering an inclusive and accessible environment to everyone?
Mm-hmm. I mean, like I think some of the early things, I'm thinking back to when I was like training to work. And when I first started working like with Venus Envy, I was just on the education team. So I did some workshops and things before that, and, and also had like a background in sex education. So I came in sort of in like a different way than a lot of other staff do. But once I started working in the store, it was the standard, like, use gender neutral language when we're talking to people. That was like, and it's funny because anyone who comes in to work there is like, well, duh, like, of course, people are kind of hired because they already get it a lot of the time. Although, sometimes there is learning to be done, but I think a lot of the time it's like people who work at Venus Envy have like wanted to work at Venus Envy, because it's a pretty particular kind of job. It's not just like anyone can come in and be like, yes, I really want to sell people sex toys, or like I really want to be involved in someone's like gender journey. It's a complicated job, but it can definitely be intense. And so there's a lot of trying to work together and support each other as well. And I think that's a really important part of working in a setting like that, that best practices aren't just for how we treat customers, but also how we treat each other and how we try to support each other when like something tricky comes up. And how we can have very, I don't know, they feel like high level, like queer theory conversations, but trying to sort of like, bring it in when we're talking to customers, of being like, we don't have to get all like theory driven and stuff, but that it's coming from a place of like, we've really thought about this. We've really done a lot of education and thinking on any of the things that we talk about. Everyone gets given the book is called Girl Sex 101. And although the title is pretty particular, it is a very cool and like very inclusive book inside. And it sort of lays out like sex and pleasure and like playing with other people in a very like not linear fashion, but sort of as like a road trip of like, there's like stops and bumps along the way, but here are all these things we can think about. And so like, that's everyone's first read, because it's, it does also talk about like pleasure for vulvas and vaginas and things like that. And that's important because a lot of us didn't get that information growing up, as you were talking about, our like patriarchy led sex education. So that has always been an important part. But, there's lots of books that we get to read when we're first starting, and lots of sort of supporting of each other. And of course, using things like gender neutral language when folks are coming in, and not making assumptions, or, people make assumptions. It's just part of our nature. But, what are we going to do with those assumptions? Are we just going to let them dissipate? Probably is the best way to do it, and kind of say like, okay. And there's lots of times where people have come in and like, I've assumed something about them, and then I'm like so excited to be wrong. I'm just like, nice. Like, I love that. I love what like my version of what these people are changes after I end up talking to them. And that like really is exciting for me. It's exciting to be wrong because it means that I've learned something. I kind of love that. And then, I think another thing that we do at Venus MB when there's like a new staff is that we do a lot of learning from each other, where like I love talking about lube. It's one of my favorite sections. And then I also love talking about like adaptive sex toys, or just adapting sex toys, because, there isn't a ton on the market right now for the adaptive stuff. And so like, I get to talk about those sections with the new staff that come in. And then like someone else who like loves talking about butts will go over the butt section, and we just keep on doing it, and we keep asking questions, and we keep on learning as we go. And whenever anything new comes in, we're like, okay, let's like ask a lot of questions and play with it and touch it and do this and that, whatever. And, we get to like read books sometimes when we're like on break, or, we have a whole slew of books that we can buy and take to borrow if we're very careful, and things like that. And also it's encouraged that we go to each other's workshops, and then we have staff trainings and things like that from like outside people. Like there's always an expectation that we're all learning as we go. Anytime something new happens, even if it's like, oh, there's a new flag now, like, cool, let's learn more about that flag and what that means, and have a conversation about it, of being like, okay, this is what's confusing me about this identity I didn't know about before, and this is where I can like understand it, and here's like some complicated feelings I have about it. And doing that in sort of the safety and comfort of our little team is a great way to not unpack our baggage on someone else. And I think that's like a big part of it,
Can I ask you then, so when, say, I'm thinking about kind of that sort of middle section of the store, outside of, say, buttons and stickers and some books. So if you have a parent of a trans or non-binary child that's coming in and they want to look at some potential supports. So you have a child who's not working yet, they don't have access to their own finances, so they might need support in that. What are some, can you list off maybe a couple of items that maybe, might be surprising to some parents that can be really helpful for young people, like in their early teens?
Yeah, so I think a big one of our big sections, or it's small in size but big in popularity, is our sort of like gender wall. And we have a lot of gender affirming gear, as we sort of call it. Usually it's things people can wear to sort of like change their body ever so slightly, to just feel a little better about what we have going on. So things like binders and gaffs. Binders are sort of like chest compression, and gaffs are like groin compression, quote unquote. And, you know, and just makes everything sort of slimmed in a way that, like, you know, certain genders will feel comfy in. We also have like additions that people can make. So like packers or STPs or stand to pee devices can be used to, you know, make it look like someone has a penis, or just to like feel that bulge there, or to pee standing up. That's a big one too for a lot of folks.
Right. So if you're a trans boy or a non-binary and you're using the male bathroom and you're out at a restaurant or something and you need to go to the washroom, you don't have to feel like you're looking like you're sitting down in a cubicle. You know, if that bothers you, you can stand to pee that way, right? Is that...
Yeah, exactly. And we have things like breast forms for, you know, like sort of more like trans feminine folks or non-binary folks who are just like looking to add some breast tissue. Yeah, things like that are sort of the, you know, very, very common things that we're asked about. I would say the most common though are like the gaffs and the binders. I find that there's a lot of like, you know, I think that when we are out in the world, a lot of assumptions are made about us based on what we have versus what we're maybe lacking. And that's just something that I've noticed in terms of like how our sales normally go, that, you know, packers we do sell a lot of, but binders we sell a lot of. That's a big one. And same with gaffs. It's also hard to find binders and gaffs like anywhere in this city.
I was gonna
like
say
the Maritimes.
Yeah, I think Venus Envy is one of, if not the only spot in Atlantic Canada that actively sells binders. Of course, you can buy them online, but you know, a lot of folks, they need to either try them on or have that like proper return policy, or they want to go in and have a conversation with someone to be like, is this what I need? Or because there's so many different types, like there's like the full top ones, there's the tank top ones. I can't remember all the names of them, but there's a lot of variations.
Exactly. And they all have names that like you don't need to know, we just need to know, and we'll measure you. There's a place you can try them on in the store, and you know, or you can measure yourself. Like we try to do a lot of like, we want you to leave with something that feels good and makes you feel good. And even like the different brands fit differently sometimes, and you know, we're trying to carry a couple of brands now, and it's just they're all very different. And you know, even like from day to day, like I'll put on a binder one day and be like, oh, this fits really well today, and I'll put it on another day and be like, well, this was a mistake, I cannot wear this anymore.
Or it's like a really hot day and you're like, I am not wearing like the full shirt one. And
exactly. Yeah. And actually, speaking of that, we do have trans tape now, which is sort of like binding tape. Although as someone, I guess, who has very sensitive skin, I have not had a lot of luck with the trans tape or the binding tape. I also find it works a bit better on folks with like smaller chests already. And I do not have a very small chest. So it kind of is like, well, maybe this is not the way to go for me. But we're trying to get in, it's been taking a while, but we're trying to get in gaff tape as well. Or I say gaff tape, and that's like an actual tape that's used in like hardware stuff.
Yeah, like it'd be safe for your skin and safe for those particular areas as well. So it'd be more the removal, I think, that would be perhaps the challenging piece, that you'd want to make sure that you're getting a good quality product and have some support if you don't know exactly how to apply it.
Exactly.
Yeah, I know a youth right now that is using the binding tape and loves it, absolutely loves it, and it's really helped with, you know, I guess it's not just affirming and that, but it's also well, it's affirming, but it's breaking down isolation and making you feel confident and going into those spaces that you should be able to be in without, you know, being misgendered, which is one of those barriers that keeps you from going somewhere if you feel like you're going to be, you know, misgendered or outed or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a huge aspect of like dysphoria. I find that the way that other people view you has so much to say for your, like, about your body, and it really complicates things. Like sometimes when I'm feeling a certain way about my own body, I'm like, where is this coming from? Is this coming from like inside? Is it coming from me? Or is it coming from them, the world, that like, I don't care about their opinions anyway. So like, why am I letting this affect me in this way? And, you know, sometimes it's often more complicated than that, but I do often feel myself being like, where is this coming from? And if it's coming from outside, what can I do about it? Nothing. I should just not care. But it's more complicated than that. And I think especially like, you know, for like youth who already have so much going on, and like they're braids around like what people think of them and, you know, how they're being read and things like that. Like I don't know, I've had a lot of time to be like, I don't really care about this anymore. Like all the shame is gone and all these, you know, obviously I have good days and bad days of being like, oh, my body's not doing what it wants. And it gets more complicated by like disability and my body like really not doing what I want it to do, and things like that. But, you know, I've come a long way from what I was as a teenager and even like a very young adult where I was like, oh, like everyone is looking at me and thinking of these things about me. And now I'm like, I'm over that. Like, I don't care what they think. I'm just going to do me. I'm going to wear what I want. I'm never going to wear a bra again. Like, not even worry about the fact that I have like breast tissue and stuff like that. I'm just kind of going for it. But, you know, it's still a different experience to someone who is maybe more like, you know, leaning like one way or the other on sort of like the binary trans lens and is, you know, looking to look a certain way. And so that's my specific experience, but yeah. But.
And as you said before, you know, like assumptions, especially if they aren't internalized, if you decide to vocalize them, they absolutely do hurt people. And I think people need to be more aware and reflective of their own assumptions on other people, especially in terms of other people's bodies, and understand the environment in which they are posing these assumptions or enforcing these assumptions onto people, because it absolutely can have negative repercussions, regardless to if it was ill-intended or not. So
totally. I even think of it when someone asks like some people what their pronouns are, but doesn't ask like another person. And I'm like, oh, you've decided that this person looks trans or like looks non-binary, when like that's not how it goes. Like either ask everyone their pronouns or like figure out a way to not use pronouns at all. And like, good luck with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. I think that was all of our kind of nitty gritty questions, but I just wanted to open up the floor to you as well in case there was anything else you wanted to add. We are always happy to have people do shout outs to their own social medias, their own products, anything that you want to talk about. But kind of the floor is yours.
Yeah. And I mean, like, we're always trying to post about like products we have, or, you know, and we can always answer questions on our social media and things. So feel free to follow us on Instagram, Venus Envy HFX. That, you know, we have lots of stuff going on. We can always answer questions. And, you know, while we are beholden to some governmental rules about selling certain kinds of products to people of certain age groups, anyone can come into the store. We can always have conversations, and we're allowed to sell like gender affirming products. That's not an issue. We can sell books, we can sell things like that. You know, where it gets more complicated is around like sex toys and things like that. So, you know, if you're looking for some gender affirmation gear, or you just want to talk about gender, you know, come on and visit us, or you know, or feel free to follow us on Instagram and we can chat there too. We're always happy to have conversations about those things.
And I love your book selection too. I mean, you have like everything from, you know, early, like, well, children's books. You have The Pink Balloon there, which is my book, which is fantastic. I love seeing that in the front section. But like, If I Was Your Girl, I love that read. I think it's a great read for even parents, you know, teens, but your teen fiction and your tween fiction and all of that. Like your whole book section it's just a pleasure to go in and browse through it. Really,
this is a full collection. Like I remember I went in and I bought a book and it was called Queering the Countryside, and it's about like queer rural experiences in Nova Scotia. Like I thought it was just like kind of general, and I started reading and I was like, they're talking about Nova Scotia. So that was really exciting. So there's and of course a lot of these books are written by local queer artists that you folks actively support. So that's really, really great.
Yeah, it's so funny, like just sort of talking about books, getting very off topic here, but I, as like a youth, hated reading. I'm not like a super fast reader. I'm still not, but I really did not like reading when I was a kid. And then over the sort of initial part of the pandemic, I got really into fan fiction and was like, oh, like I don't mind reading if it's characters that I like. And then sort of like going back to work and being like at Venus Envy and just like picking up a book every so often, I was like, oh, I can kind of get into this. Like seeing queer representation in the things I'm reading made me like reading. And that was just something I didn't have access to for like so long when I was a kid. And I'm like, oh, that's what it is. So yeah, if you're like, and we have graphic novels too, like there's lots of different ways to find that experience and to, you know, feel yourself represented in the media that you consume. There's lots more on like Netflix and on TV now and stuff like that, but sometimes it's just not enough. And there's a lot of really cool queer books out there, and books with trans characters and queer characters and non-binary characters and like ace characters too. And like, it's just been so exciting to see, these characters written by people who either like identify with those identities or, maybe are somewhat removed from them, but still are usually still queer at least. There's something there that draws them to these characters and to making these characters feel representative of people that we didn't get to see growing up. It was really hard to find. And they're not like tragic stories where like, oh, they're all about coming out and it going poorly, or like it's about like finding yourself. And coming of age story is nice and things like that. But sometimes it's just nice to see queer people existing and living their lives. And sometimes there's a sexy scene in there.
I was going to say, sometimes you got to find a good queer smut book. Exactly. And there's no shame in that.
Yeah.
They're hard to find. You can't go to chapters and be like, where's the queer smut?
Exactly.
Where is it?
Yeah. I love smut. That is my preferred method of like, I don't know, sexy media. I'm not a porn watcher. I can't quite get it in the zone. But definitely a smut fan for sure.
Very fair. Very fair. Well, yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Always a treat to get to talk about this stuff.
That's all the time we have today, folks. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Hey Sis.
The conversation doesn't have to stop here, though. If you would like to get in touch with us to ask us a question or share your story on a future episode, you can email us at connect@simplygoodform.com or visit us on our website at www.heysis.com.